you will find it interesting, and I'm going to go through this here in a minute, that it did take humanity a while to know about him as he is today, like as the independent enemy. You see, most of the Old Testament references to Satan aren't references to the devil as we think of him today, like the, red guy with horns and a pitchfork, which is not even the right image anyway, but that's what a lot of us think. Red guy with horns and a pitchfork orchestrating all the evil in the world. But for several thousand years, God's people didn't know that kind of a Satan. They only knew the Hebrew word that the name Satan comes from, which is Satan, spelled the same, S-A-T-A-N, Satan. And that just means adversary. And so you'll see throughout the Old Testament, I'm going to show you here in a minute, they use the word Satan, sometimes as a verb, the act of being an adversary, sometimes as the title of a person, sometimes the title of one of God's angels. There's actually no evidence from the writings in the first few thousand years of human history that God's people thought of the devil like most of us do today. Now, I know I better back that up with some Bible lest you think the cheese has fallen off my sandwich. Let's start with Adam and Eve. That's usually where people first think about where the devil appears. And I believe it is where he first appears, but Adam and Eve didn't know that. Neither did Cain or Noah or Moses or David. If you read the Genesis story there of the garden, there's no mention of an enemy or devil. It's just a serpent who tempts. They thought of the serpent in the garden as one of God's created creatures who had a role of testing people. I mentioned David. He used the word Satan or Satan in Hebrew as a verb. In Psalm 38:20, David prays, "They repay me evil for good and oppose me for pursuing good." The word oppose, they oppose me. In Hebrew, that word oppose is Satan. Some other translations use the word accuse, same thing. Oppose, accuse. Here, David is talking about human enemies who Satan him, which mean they oppose or accuse him. 1 Kings 5:4. King Solomon said, "But now the Lord my God has given me peace on every side. I have no enemies, and all is well." The Hebrew word there for enemies is, you guessed it, Satan. And he's talking about humans. Have you heard the story about Balaam? It's in Numbers. In short, God gave a man named Balaam an instruction. And when Balaam set out, not following the instruction, set out in rebellion to God, the Bible says in Numbers 22:22 that God was angry that Balaam was going, so he sent the angel of the Lord to stand in the road to block his way. Well, that angel of the Lord who stood in his way, in Hebrew, you're going to find it there if you have a Hebrew Bible, it's Satan. So in other words, Numbers says that God sent a Satan, an adversary, to block his way. In Zechariah, we read about a Satan who is in the company of another one of God's angels. Zechariah 3:1 says, "Then the angel showed me Jeshua," which is Joshua, "the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. The accuser, Satan, was there at the angel's right hand, making accusations against Jeshua." So do you notice the kind of evolution so far in these verses and how the word Satan is used? The older verses, like that one from Psalms that David prayed, the older verses use Satan as a job description, an accuser, an adversary. Could be human, could be angelic, but over time, the name evolves into something a bit more supernatural, a bit more like we know of him as today. And you'll see this in other writings that came after what's called the Babylonian exile. I know it's a big word, don't get caught up with it. It's just a moment in history, almost 600 years before Jesus, when Jerusalem was overtaken by the Babylonians, and the people were taken in captivity to them. So, references to Satan in writings after this time start to be much more sinister in nature. And First Chronicles is one of them. It's a book that, the name says, chronicles the history of Israel. And in verse 21:1, it says, Satan rose up against Israel and caused David to take a census of the people of Israel. So the author there, looking back on history, with God's inspiration, of course, recognized some of the events were actually inspired by Satan, as we know of him today, Satan himself. We see the same thing in the account of Job. Job lived many years before all of this, but the story wasn't written down as we have it today until this period after the exile. Many of you know Job's story. It describes a man who God saw as blameless, and Satan wanted to test that. He told God that the only reason Job revered him is because of all the blessings that God has given him. So, Satan made a bet that if Job's blessings were taken away, then Job would curse God. And as the story goes, Satan proceeds to take things from Job, everything but his wife, basically. All along, however, Job had no idea there was some sinister spirit behind his losses. He blamed God. He's quoted as saying, the Lord gives and takes away. He believed, like most everybody did at the time that he lived, that God is the one who makes good things happen and bad things happen, gives and takes away. And that's kind of a great place for me to recap the evolution of the awareness of Satan as an enemy throughout the Old Testament. Before this Babylonian exile, which again happened 600 years roughly before Jesus, 586 to be exact, they think. But before that, people saw God as the sender of both good and bad, just as Job said. They saw him as someone who sent adversaries in order to test them. Sometimes those adversaries were people, sometimes they were angels, but they were always gods. But with the devastation of the exile, God's people had to start to make sense of these evil things that were happening that God could not be responsible for because it would have broken his promises. And so we begin to hear Satan uses a proper name of a sinister spirit, a supernatural enemy independent of God. And maybe you're wondering, why? Why would God let people go on for at least several thousand years blaming him for things he wasn't responsible for? I don't know. Maybe you want a better answer than that, but all I can say is God did that with all kinds of things. He didn't program us with all knowledge. He programmed us to discover and learn. Seems like he likes that. Even though his character gets tarnished in the process. He did it with storms. He did it with the source of diseases. People attributed all those things to him at one time. There are lots of things in human history that we once blamed on God that we later discovered wasn't God at all. And the root of evil is one of them. By the time of Jesus, though, there was no question. People understood that there were evil spirits, and Jesus referred to Satan or the devil as the leader of the pack. At the very beginning of his ministry, you'll read it in Matthew 4. Jesus faced the devil in the wilderness. In Matthew 25, verse 41, Jesus says, "Away with you, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons." Jesus referred to him as the ruler or the god of the world. Paul said that it's the devil who blinds people to God's goodness. Peter likened the devil to a roaring lion. John said that Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. In my study notes, as I was preparing for this message, I have at least 14 New Testament verses that all speak of the devil as a real being who slanders, accuses, and opposes independently of God.